So as the panel observed, AI policy and regulation are becoming important at national level. So coming up, we have a very special panel that we're very fortunate that we could put together. So I'll introduce the moderator and the speakers. So please come up as I introduce you. So Professor James Kurose, an Assistant Director of Computers and Information Science and Engineering at the NSF, and Professor of Computer Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. John Beieler, he's Program Manager at IARPA, the Intelligence and Advanced Research Project Activity Agency. Professor Juan Mesa, Division Director of Mathematical Sciences at NSF and Professor of Applied Mathematics and Dean of the School of Natural Sciences at UC Merced. And also we're fortunate to be joined by Dr. Tony Thrall. He's a Technical Director of the Office of Chief Data Scientist at the NSA. Thank you so much for making it.
So we're all very happy to be here for this panel, which I think follows very nicely on the panel. Actually, we can continue the discussion from the panel that we just had here. We have 4 folks from agencies here, and this question of the transition from theory to practice and what it means for a mission agency or for a basic science agency like the National Science Foundation, but how we make our case to Congress and the administration for, for the investments that we make, all absolutely address the questions that came up in the last panel. So we're going to start. A couple of us have slides. A couple of us are just going to make remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we'll try to regain just a couple of minutes so that we're the only thing standing between us, lunch, and some very interesting posters. So John, you want to go first?
All right, so while they switch over the slides, as an introduction, I'm John Beieler. I'm a program manager at IARPA. I'm not really going to talk that much about IARPA today. For those of you who haven't heard about IARPA, or like DARPA but smaller and focused on the IC, where the IC is the U.S. intelligence community. So I'm going to give talk a little bit instead about coming at these things from an intelligence community perspective. I didn't realize I was going to have another person from the community on the panel, so I'll keep it brief and keep it to the point. Am I driving these slides? No, I don't see one. No. It's just this button right here. This button? All right, cool. All right. Great start. Anyways, so about 6 or 8 months ago, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence came out with this strategy, because it's 2019 and everyone has to have an AI strategy now. So this is ours. It's called the AIM Initiative, and AIM stands for Augmenting Intelligence Using Machines. You will note that that decidedly does not say artificial intelligence using machines. It's augmenting intelligence. The goal of this is we have these hordes and hordes of analysts that are very well trained, very good at what they do. We want to augment them in a variety of ways. If you pull up the strategy, it's available on the web at odni.gov. It talks about AAA technologies, augmentation, automation, and artificial intelligence. So again, artificial intelligence, machine learning is really only one component of this. And just to call out a few things that this strategy talks about, it outlines a set of objectives. Some are more near-term, some are more long-term. The punchy quote from Sue Gordon, the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, is that if it's knowable and it's important, then we know it. So this strategy is really all about getting useful information to the analyst at the right time, in the right place, and the right format. So to tie in a little bit to the previous panel, what this is really focused on is getting the stuff that you wonderful people are doing transitioned into use for our intelligence agencies. We talk a lot about basic research, we talk a lot about applied research. That's kind of gone out of the window, right? I have this nice chart that my day job is doing HLT and NLP things, and there's this nice chart of all the innovations that have dropped in the open source, and it's functionally every 30 days, right? So we currently operate under this idea that, IARPA and DARPA and NSF do this basic research, and then we hand that off to some applied research lab, and they bump the tech readiness level up a level or two, then we hand this off to the agencies, and then they tweak things. And this is a multi-year, multi-person problem, whereas on the outside, people are iterating every 30 days, and we just don't keep up with that pace. So really what we're focused on is how do we transition these things when some of the concepts of basic research, applied research, don't really fit so much anymore. And just to give an idea of what we mean by where we, the community, can invest in the gaps, we think we have some unique concerns that maybe aren't particularly focused on by industry. So we talk about AI assurance and AI security. Just to define these terms a little bit, I see Hava in the audience with DARPA GUARD. There's a couple of programs going on at IARPA that look at this area. So we talk about AI security as adversarially intentionally breaking these things. I'm sure everyone here knows about adversarial examples, but also including things like model inversion and membership inference attacks, things like data poisoning and bad net attacks. How do we prevent people from intentionally doing things to our models that we don't want them to do? But then there's this broader notion of AI assurance. So we, as the government, like to do validation and verification on things before we deploy them out, and we don't really know how to do that great for these algorithms. As was mentioned on the previous panel, these things are getting deployed into kind of high-risk situations, and in our world, these are very consequential decisions that might be made as a consequence of the output of these models. So how do we know when they'll fail? How do we know how they'll fail? How will we know when they're actually failing? So these are some of the things that we want to invest in to push forward the boundaries to say how can we shake these models before we deploy them out into operational settings. And then on the basic research side, these are just a quick rundown of some things that we've identified as potentially interesting to us. So trust is one that I call out, both in the systems and the system outputs. Kind of naively, this boils down to explainability, right? Why did you make that decision algorithm? But it's also broader, right? Trust doesn't just stop at explainability. We don't have to explain every decision that every model has made to every analyst, but we need to figure out some way that we can engender broader trust in the deployment of these systems in the analyst community so that they don't come poke us every time. Because kind of listening to the talks from this morning, analysts read all these articles that say AI, neural nets are a black box. We don't know why they work. So whenever one of us, the nerds, goes to them and says, look at my great black box, they're like, I just don't trust that thing. So how do we get away from that narrative a little bit that these are black boxes that we, the scientists, don't understand? And that only goes downstream. This idea of human-machine teaming, and so this goes beyond the notion of, hey, analysts, you're just going to become labelers for data. Doesn't that sound great? It doesn't, in case anyone was curious. So this is more than just human in the loop, right? With the machine kicking uncertain cases out to a human to get clarified labels. This is how do we let analysts do the things that they're very good at? How do we let computers do the things that they're very good at and team them together in a true symbiosis? Obviously, we're the community, so we care about things that are by definition things that don't happen all that often. So we exist in an inherently low shot or no shot environment. I heard mention of n equals 1. That's where we live. So this idea of having thousands, hundreds, millions, billions of training points just won't hold for us. And then the final thing that this strategy calls out explicitly, and I put it in quotes, is sense making. It's in quotes because sense making means everything and nothing. But the general notion here is we have data coming from multiple data domains, multiple places, and we want to fuse all that together. But also have some notion of why things are happening. That's really the crux of intelligence analysis, is understanding the why, right? Why things happen, what will happen next. These are fundamentally questions of causality, and these are things that we don't do great right now. So we want to fuse data and understand why these things happen. And with that, hopefully I've kept to my time, and we'll kick it over to the next person. Thank you.
Great, thanks. If I go like this, will it go forward to my slides? Hopefully they'll come up in just a second. So my name's Jim Kurose. I am the Assistant Director at NSF for the Directorate of Computer and Information Science and Engineering. SISE, I'm in my fifth and final year, leading the SISE Directorate. And what I want to leave you with here are just a few thoughts about how we start, how we fund, how we advocate for science programs in particular areas. And then I'm going to start at the highest level, and then I'm going to drive it down to this very specific topic that we're talking about here yesterday and today. So at the very highest level, there is nobody higher here in DC than the boss, the president, and Congress as well. So I never knew this as a faculty. I've been a faculty member for 30 plus years at the University of Massachusetts. I had never heard of the budget priorities memo, but it turns out that if you're an agency here in Washington, the President's Budget Priority Memo is a very important document. It is a way for the Director of OMB and the head of OSTP and the White House to signal what their priorities are for research, whether it's basic, whether it's applied. And so for the 2020 fiscal year that we're about to enter into, you see it's a really short memo, and so when you get a lot of space saying things like fundamental and applied AI, including machine learning, autonomous systems, applications at the human technology frontier, you see some quantum there, and then down at the bottom again, data, analytics, machine learning. So that's the administration signaling to the agencies, and us as agencies signaling to everybody else saying, okay, these are really important areas. Every administration also puts out a national security strategy, a national defense strategy. If you were to look in there, you will see machine learning and AI in particular called out. And as many of you know, there was an AI executive order that the president signed just a few weeks ago. So at the very highest levels of government, the areas that you are all interested in are being signaled as really, really important. Okay? Now, I want to show you maybe a computer science view now of how we talk to Congress in particular, but to others in the administration about what we do. And I'm just curious, how many people here have heard of something called the tire tracks diagram? One. Wow. Okay. Usually it's like 5%, which to me is really low, but we've reached a new low, but that's okay. And the reason I want to show you this, so last year when the National Science Foundation director, Franz Cordova, went to Congress to speak about the NSF budget, this was the only graphic that she used, right? So it's an important graphic, and I want to show you it. So the only thing, you can forget about all the text on the left, that's just how important computing is. What I want to show you is the diagram on the right. And so what you see here, you see three lines going up. There's a red one for university, there's a blue one for industry, and then there's a green one. When it's thin, it's $1 billion product area. When it gets fat, it's $10 billion, and it goes up over time. And those arrows going back and forth are the interplay. So each of these are a documented case of an artifact, a paper, a person, a piece of software, an idea that flows back and forth between industry in the areas of networking or software technologies. And this has actually been done. So this is from a National Research Council 2016. It's been done in lots of areas, including AI and robotics. The reason I wanted to show you this is this talks about the research ecosystem writ large here in the United States, where those of us in academia, we do our work, but we also interact with folks in industry. And at a national standpoint, this, if you will, it's more than text transfer. It's not like you're throwing something over the back of the boat and hoping somebody uses it. It's this interplay back and forth over time that's really, really important and really helps us when we talk about the value proposition for funding research. A value proposition, not the only one. Sometimes people say, oh, well, that diagram ended in 2010 and now it's 2018, so people always ask, well, what have you done lately? So I will let you know that I always use machine learning. Someone was talking about perceptrons. We don't quite go back that far in the discussion, but if you go back and look at some of the work in reinforcement learning and some of the deep learning algorithms, this is work that's been funded now for multiple decades, and we're really seeing the fruits of that research right now. Okay, a couple words about NSF, and then I want to dive down into machine learning and deep learning in particular. So Juan Mesa, my colleague, will talk about DMS, mathematics and statistics. I wanted to give you sort of a size view of artificial intelligence. Many of you may have met or seen Henry Couch yesterday, who leads our division of information and intelligence systems. That has a budget of a little over $200 million a year. That's where a lot of the core AI research in NSF is done, along with DMS and engineering. The total expenditures are almost $500 million, so that's actually quite a lot of investment being made in that particular area. You see some of the programmatics that we've had in place, Smart and Connected STAR, basically, and we have a number of new initiatives that are being launched in 2019, something on AI and society, actually with the Partnership for AI. That's a large 501c3 that was initially founded by Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, IBM, and Apple. and now it's grown quite a bit. So doing a joint solicitation with folks with more of an industry bent, a real-time machine learning done between science and engineering, also with DARPA, and a Dear Colleague letter about fairness, ethics, accountability, and transparency, the interpretability that was talked about last time. Okay? Now, I want to start diving down just a little bit deeper to talk about this issue of interpretability. And so if any of you wonder, does anybody care about what you're doing? The answer is yes, right? And I don't know, maybe it's because I'm an academic. I always look to theory for the answers, right? Those are where the real truths are going to be found. And so you see up there the AI R&D strategic plan that was put together by in the previous administration. It's going to be updated within the next couple months, actually, and you'll see again the need for explainable and transparent systems there. The CCC, the Community Computing Consortium, just came out with a 20-year roadmap for AI research, came out last week, and you'll see there again, robust and trustworthy. I've seen this word trust now show up multiple times in the discussions here. When you think about ethics, and I know there's been discussion about that here, and when our systems are being used, whether in the judiciary to make life-saving or life-critical discussions there, the issue of the ethics is going to come up. And so the IEEE, Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and also the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Order 15 democratic countries, both calling out the importance of what we're doing here. And when you think about transparency, I mean, this again is this call to get away from the black box that we've been talking about. So I think really a lot of people, a lot of organizations around the globe are really looking at the theory community to really build the foundations for this moving forward. So how do you build those foundations? My last two slides are just, how does a community come together to do something, right? So you're a group of individuals, we're all individuals. You know, you could apply, for instance, to core programs in IIS or CCF within SIZE or DMS. These are where the theoretical foundations of artificial intelligence are being done within the National Science Foundation. We have core programs there, small, medium, large, so it could be you, a couple people, a few people working together. It's also possible, and this is the idea I really want to leave you with, it's possible for the community to come together and do something. And I'm going to give you an example of tripods, which some of you may have heard of. It's the best acronym I've seen in my 5 years, Transdisciplinary Research in Principles of Data Science. It's a great acronym. Mathematicians, statisticians, and computer science, so 3 tripods all coming together. You know, I think there's a really excellent lesson there that I'll talk about. And then there are center scale activities like STCs. There's a Center for the Science of Information, for example, and you see the participants in that. So you can do things at all sort of different scales, right? And this is something of national importance. And are we going to solve that as a collection of individuals? Are we going to solve it with some really focused programs that bring together individuals into networks and teams? I guess the future will tell. So my last slide, I want to leave you with just sort of a lesson from something that actually mathematics and statistics at NSF and computer science at NSF worked on together, something called tripods. Okay, so the idea was that mathematicians, so it was all about foundations, right? So helping to develop the theory, the additional needed theory under data science, that mathematicians, statisticians, and theoretical computer scientists should be able to come together and work with each other. So the first thing you do, if you ever want to do something like that, is you have a workshop. Now I'll tell you, actually it's being recorded, so I'll tell you anyway. So we had a wonderful workshop, and honestly, we went into that workshop with the math institutes as a possible outcome. Like, okay, we'll do a couple of math institutes, that are going to be data science related. And we went into that workshop, and the community came out of that and said, no, you know what, it's too early to put the bets down in one or two areas. What we need to do is we need to work together so we understand each other's language a little bit better. And so they proposed a bunch of centerlets, which actually we ended up funding. We were thinking of funding 5 to 10. There were so many good ones. We funded 12 projects at 17.7 million, right? And so this has now set the foundation, I think, for what will be the next stage, these larger scale centers, as well as another call for phase one, these initial sort of centerlet type of activities. And I guess I just want to leave you with the question for all of you to ponder as individuals, but also as a community here. How do you all want to come together individually or as a community to tackle these really, really important problems that society is and the nation is asking you to solve? Okay, and this is just one example, and as on the previous slide, there are many ways to go. So I think we're going in alphabetical order, so I'm going to turn things over to Juan next.
All right, thank you, Jim. So I don't have any slides. I decided it'd be a little easier just give you some remarks thinking over the last 2 days that I've been here. And first of all, let me wish everybody Happy Pi Day. I'm staying away from pie today because I just have had enough already. But I also want to thank the organizers before I start off with the opportunity to be here. It's been very great to hear all these great talks. I've learned a lot, and there's certainly been some very thought-provoking talks and panels as well. So we were asked to comment on the drivers and other considerations that we use for investments in academic research. And as I was thinking about this, it kind of fell into 3 buckets. And so what I wanted to do is just give you a very brief overview of how I see that. And they're going to parallel some of the comments that Jim made, because I think it's very important for you guys to understand, how these types of processes work, because I think there's a great role for the community to play in, and we really would welcome more input from you guys. So the 3 buckets. So the first one that I'll point out to is I think one of the things that everybody in the audience knows here is that AI is being used everywhere. And then from our point of view, increasingly so in science and engineering fields. If you take a look at some of the examples from yesterday, we heard from particle physics, genomics, chemistry. There's also examples in astronomy, materials. I can point to many different types of awards that we've made in the last couple of years. It essentially spans every scientific field and engineering field that we have at NSF. By another measure, if I take a look around at the funding that we have within the Division of Mathematical Sciences at DMS, our investments have essentially tripled over the last 2 years. And just if you do keyword searches on things like machine learning or AI or deep learning or things like that. So that's sort of an indicator of what we're seeing from the community. So let's call that proposal pressure driven as one of the drivers. The second one is one that Jim has talked a little bit about, and this is sort of coming from within NSF. He mentioned harnessing the data revolution, which is one of NSF's 10 big ideas. And these were new initiatives that were started in 2016. First time that we will get funding is in this fiscal year, and the harnessing data revolution is one such example. The goal for that one is to enable new data-driven research in science and engineering. And as we looked at this program, and Jim gave an example of how we got started, the community really came together and came with some ideas on what they wanted to see funded. A lot of it was driven by things that they had seen in their own communities, but it really, I think, is a great example of how the community had, I think it's a great success story of they saw something that needed to be addressed. They came together, they essentially wrote the parameters of this program, and a year or so later a program came out. It was so successful, and we had so many people asking us for something similar to that we came up with HDR tripods, very creative in our naming of programs. And it's now going to be a new solicitation, and that's out on the streets, and the deadline, I believe, for the solicitation is early May or March, I believe. I think LOIs are in March, and then the final proposals are in May. So this is something that the community drove. We listened to that, and is now, I think, a very successful program. So that's a community-driven program, and that's essentially the second driver that I wanted to talk about. But the last one, and I have a third one, is one that I think is maybe the most important from our perspective. And that is what I will call, we are at NSF are curiosity-driven research. That's what we like to fund. Fundamental research, discovery-driven, whatever words you'd like to use for that. And we've heard a lot in the last 2 days about AI, and it's becoming ubiquitous. But we've also, or at least I've heard several comments which I will now quote, and apologies to people that I'm quoting because I didn't write down the names of everybody, so if you feel like you've said this, please come to me and I'll give you attribution. One of them was, models can predict very well, but they can't explain themselves. The second one was, I think this was this morning, magic property of reality that makes local search work. This is something you really want to hear and something you're using in an autonomous vehicle, right? Too little science going on in machine learning. So from my perspective, I believe that one of the responsibilities of the Division of Mathematical Sciences is to support fundamental research, curiosity-driven research, as I've mentioned. And this seems to be, from everything I've heard today and everything that we know of from the last couple of years, that this is a great example of what we really should be investing in. We don't know why a lot of these things work. And so I'll finish with one last quote, and I think this one was Dr. Sejnowski, who gave the example of Fourier from 150 years ago, where he said that the new class of functions will give rise to new mathematics. So in a certain sense, the way I think about it is, this is a case where, in fact, what we're really doing is it's a mission-driven responsibility for us to take a look at these kinds of examples and then use it to invest in new mathematics for the future. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for doing my work for me, particularly John for the framing of the questions here. I think I'll just be underscoring very, very quickly what has already been said. I'm Tony Thrall. I'm with the NSA, and I came to the NSA just a few years ago. Previously, I'd worked in industry, for example, on search engines. Basically, my aim in those days was to help businesses improve incrementally. Now I'm at the National Security Agency, so my aim is to help with national security decisions. That transition has been thought-provoking for me, and I wrote down a few of those thoughts to share with you, but they are items that have already been talked about this morning. First of all, for high-stakes decisions, the user needs to have some understanding of the derivation of the results. This has been remarked on several times. Similarly, the guidance on the reliability and applicability of the model is needed beyond the model's performance on holdout data sets. And last, I wanted to say that our supervised learning requires the time of domain experts. So we're very interested in stratagems to leverage that precious expertise with minimal disruption to normal workflows. So those are the kinds of areas that we're interested in. I want to add to that unlike NSF, who is structured to fund particularly academic research, the NSA is not in that position, but we know the importance and are increasingly want to engage in with the larger data science community. We see the necessity for that. We're very excited by all of the developments going on, and I'm very encouraged by this morning's work in particular on examining sort of the foundations and taking this back to more theoretical underpinnings. It's something we need, as John was remarking, for these high-stakes decisions, we really need to be able to count on these systems to give us something we can believe in. So thank you.
Okay, so I think we should probably keep the questions relatively short so we can catch up a little bit of time, and because there are poster sessions during lunch, but maybe we could take just a couple of questions.
So this has to do with the flurry of announcements of various programs and things. Have you been taking note of what's happening in China as part of the background for the motivation here?
So I guess I better answer that one. Well, it would be hard not to take note of what's happening in China, but also what's happening in Canada and happening in the UK and happening in France. And so clearly, lots of countries are making, big bets on AI as a driver for the future, and that has to do with economic competitiveness, that tire track diagram, but also national security and national defense, and quite honestly, for the good of their populations. And so yes, I mean, certainly, I think all the agencies are very aware of what's happening around the country. I think that's one of the reasons why you saw, well, I certainly can't speak for the White House, so I won't even try. I might imagine that, that was one of the reasons for an AI executive order to really put a stake in the ground. I will point out that the AI R&D strategic plan came out in 2016, and that was put together by the best minds in government. And those best minds in government are still, in many cases, still in government, right? So in that case, we had a head start. That's being updated right now. So I think that when you see things like the R&D strategic plan saying, or the R&D budget priority memo saying, hey, we need to prioritize foundational research in artificial intelligence and in data science, that's this administration. It's also the Congress, if you look at what Congress is saying also, these are important areas for the country. So I think everybody is really aware of that, and everybody's aware that it's a global race for talent, and it's a global race for ideas. Absolutely.
So it's my understanding that the executive order came out of the Department of Defense.
The executive order came out of the
From
Department-
the executive order making the AI priority was
Nope.
something, was actually, motivated by the Department of Defense. Is that true?
Well, let's see. Again, I can't speak for the administration, but I would say that, well, first of all, it came out of the White House, and when you look at the structure of it, right, it's really speaking to all agencies. So absolutely, there's an incredibly important defense component, and if you look at what the DoD has been doing with the JAIC, the Joint AI Center, what they've been actually doing in ethics, really being out in front of that, there's a lot of activity there, but that's not the sole driver, right? So absolutely, as I said before, the National Defense Strategy is absolutely a driver, but so is economic competitiveness, and so is national security. So I don't think it's quite right to say that it's being driven solely by the Department of Defense. But again, let me say that's just my own personal opinion, and as a rotator and not a federal employee, I haven't quite learned how to quite phrase that elegantly enough, but that's just my own personal take on that.
I have a question about, structurally we see that, in private companies that doing AI research, that the role of engineers and things like this is very critical, and a lot of the funding, particularly I'm thinking kind of NSF DOE type funding, is largely going to graduate students and postdocs and academics, and it tends to come in kind of short 2-year, 3-year type grants, and so there's this challenge structurally about how do we align things in the universities to be able to have this kind of capacity on the software engineering side and technical capacity, and I'm just curious if any of the programs that you're doing are kind of aligned to trying to help make that easier, because it's also true, I think we've talked about things about like reproducibility and stuff like that. Those are not necessarily highly valued for like tenure track decisions and things currently, but they're very important for the health of the ecosystem. So I'm curious from the agency's point of view, what's being done there.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things on that. So using the example of the 2 R&D programs I have at IARPA, those are intentionally forcing performers to deliver things in Docker containers that conform to a spec, right? And it's a pretty lightweight way of doing things that I think doesn't require a huge software engineering heavy lift. So part of this is if we can be better at articulating, if you build things this way, we will be able to take them, right? So now we don't have to have you drop a large software monolith on us, and then we don't have to rip that thing apart and figure out how to use something that's inside that. So I think part of this is a 2-way communication. What is easiest for y'all to pass to us, and what do we need to be able to catch and receive the things that you're producing? And this goes to that note that I had about when new kind of foundational capabilities are being dropped every 30 days, we can't do this massive 18-month software engineering effort to get those in, right? So how do we tighten that cycle closer than that?
Maybe I could comment on that from the NSF point of view. Actually, I see, I didn't know IARPA referred to their PIs as performers. That's the DARPA language that I remember from being a DARPA performer. Right, right. I mean, you raise a really, really great question, and I think I'm going to tell you about a couple of programs that I think are aimed squarely at that, but I think that's just the beginning of the tide, because that's absolutely, it's critical to have research infrastructure, and that doesn't just mean cycles, right? That means software, that means the higher level, whether it's an open knowledge network or something like that, you need that higher level set of infrastructure in order to do the science. And increasingly, I think that's more software oriented. So let me give you two examples of NSF solicitations that are trying to directly address that. So within the SIZE Directorate, we have something called Campus Cyber Infrastructure, CC Star. If you look at the solicitation, the most recent solicitation, if you look at the 5th bullet in the list of 5 things, that's actually called out specifically that kind of software support and software expertise. The other program that I'd point to at NSF, and I can tell you about what NIH is doing that's related to that, is there's a cloud access solicitation that's open right now. And the idea here is well, we've got the researchers over here, we've got multiple cloud vendors over here, and what it's been is an M by N match where N is the cardinality of the number of researchers, right? And what we wanted to do is put something in between the researchers, put an entity in between the researchers and multiple cloud vendors where it could be a repository of shared software, it can help with education as well, and it can share expertise across all the, on the PI side of the research community. So NSF is doing that with what's called cloud access solicitation. NIH has sort of a matching or similar solicitation out now for something called STRIDES. It's a better acronym, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's a little bit more data oriented, but it's again that same concept of trying to have an entity that serves as a focal point for sharing and for leveraging what other folks are doing within your research community. So I agree with you, that's an incredibly important topic. I see NSF, NIH beginning to address that, and I think we'll see more of that in the future.
Great. Thank you.
So one thing that's on my mind is regulation. So it seems that as we move to mission critical AI, government regulation of AI is inevitable. And I wonder if anyone can comment on regulation by government of industry or by government of itself using AI.
Well, maybe I'll repeat the question, then you can answer it. The question had to do with regulation of AI, and in particular, as we start moving towards life-critical systems that are relying on AI as an underlying technology, what's happening with respect to regulation. And again, Juan and I come from a science agency, so we don't even operate in a policy space, much less a regulation space. Do any of my colleagues? Hava. Right, so I mean, I don't think what we haven't seen yet are regulations sort of coming down. What you do see, as Hava mentioned, are multilateral discussions going on among countries. So the OECD, there's an AI experts group that is in the process of issuing a report that starts to get to that, some of the issues about humans in the loop and what kinds of responsibilities as individuals or what kind of rights we have might have as individuals with respect to decisions that are being made by AI systems. I think one of the things that perhaps might be a good place to start thinking about regulation is that, well, we have a lot of existing laws on the books already. And so the question is, so AI it's another technology. We don't understand it as well as we do. But if you think about prediction, there's lots of ways to do prediction. Now, all of a sudden, we're using some machine learning algorithm to do prediction. Does that make that any different from having done a simple regression? And, so there are laws against discrimination, for example, and there are decision-making algorithms that are used already and laws already on the books. So I think probably one of the first steps is to be thinking about to what extent do existing laws cover the kinds of questions that one might ask about regulation. Certainly it's not going to cover all of them, and then it's going to be to say, okay, well, this isn't covered by existing regulatory policy. What should we be thinking about there?
Are there any other questions to the panel? So thank you so much for coming, gentlemen.
All right, pleasure to meet you.